Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest in 2021. And aren't we all glad to have 2020 in the rearview mirror? Believe it or not, there was news in 2020 that was not pandemic related. In fact, we began the year before anyone really knew what COVID-19 and social distancing were. And the 2020 session of the Washington State Legislature began after Governor Jay Inslee had dropped out of the presidential race and declared a run for governor for a rare third term. Austin Jenkins, Olympia correspondent, joined us to talk about what was ahead in the 2020 legislative session that began in January.
There are proposals from the governor and the attorney general to ban so-called assault weapons and to also limit magazine capacity. These are not new ideas, but what is new is that the governor is getting behind them, and there is a new Speaker of the House who has been supportive of these sorts of gun control measures in the past. The question is, might she allow votes on these kinds of bills? A couple of other topics to be watching for: the potential for a vote to repeal the death penalty statute. We've already had the Supreme Court in this state rule our statute unconstitutional. We're not doing executions anymore, but there's an interest in the part of opponents of the death penalty in removing it from the books. Like just a couple of other topics, the biggest union in the state has come out with its agenda, and that includes a number of items, including secure scheduling, which would be to give employees at least 2 weeks advance notice of their schedule, especially people working in more of the fast food environment where their schedules change a lot.
Of course, the 2021 session will be much different. First of all, most lawmakers will be voting remotely and not even at the Capitol. And two, a lot of the topics will be focused more on COVID relief and addressing racial justice and systemic racism throughout the state. Of course, those protests didn't just happen in big cities like Seattle and Portland. They happened throughout the Northwest, including in Spokane. In June, correspondent Nick Deshay joined us to talk about some of the protests and the police response that happened in downtown Spokane.
It was a Sunday, and I just went down there with my recording equipment just to see what was going on and also to be on hand in case things took a turn for the worst. And I got down there right before it was supposed to start at 2 p.m., and there was already more than 1,000 people down there. I tried my best to stay socially distant and kept across the street where the police officers were lined up. I went through there and talked to them, and they said they hadn't really had any trouble yet, and kind of just watched the crowd. And before you knew it, the march began, and everybody started walking out of Riverfront Park and downtown Spokane and across the Monroe Street Bridge to the Spokane County Courthouse. And by this time, according to some estimates, there were 3,000 to 3,500 people in this march. Got to the courthouse, people were still chanting. It was a sight to see everybody, or most of the people in the crowd, take a knee, as it said, to go onto one knee and put their arm raised up in a fist in front of the courthouse, chanting things like Black Lives Matter and hands up, don't arrest me, and I can't breathe. And there were really no signs of trouble from what I could see. And it was a very peaceful rally. Everybody was pretty joyful, and it was a little odd in the age of pandemic to see so many people gathered in one spot. That was kind of what was striking to me. But the people that had come out did it for a reason, obviously, and weren't too overly concerned, though most people were still wearing face masks and trying to stay separate as best they could.
One of the things that came out of these protests was the convergence of multiple groups across the political spectrum, from the right, left, and otherwise. Groups like the Boogaloo Boys, Patriot Prayer, Proud Boys, Three Percenters, Antifa. These are terms that became household names. Journalist Leah Satilli has covered many of these groups in her reporting with Oregon Public Broadcasting and the Bundyville podcast. She joined us in June to talk about them.
I think that in the media, there's been a lot of portrayal of, these people getting in fights and things like that. I think that really it is just sort of this kind of very small group that is committing violence, but that's what's being picked up on to sort of propagate these rumors that these vans full of Antifa are coming to your town to destroy things, which have been wholeheartedly disproven.
Indeed, and in some cases, it's been shown that it was anti-government or far right-wing groups who were pretending to be Antifa or putting messages on social media to sort of play up that angle and that rumor. So interesting dynamics there. I want to move on a little bit to the Bundyville podcast, your work over the last several years. Seasons 1 and 2 of that, of course, delved into the anti-government movement and the militia movement. And I wonder if people might have thought some of that went away in the 90s after Ruby Ridge, and then, of course, the Oklahoma City bombing several years later. And maybe we didn't really hear much about that sort of movement for a long time. I wonder, though, from your perspective and your research on this, did it ever really go away, or are we just hearing about it more because of our internet connected world and we just see those sorts of things more often now, and it never really was gone?
Yeah, it wasn't gone. I think that you really saw numbers dip off after the Oklahoma City bombing, that there was this sort of big violent thing with this huge death toll, and people really kind of backed away from that. However, under the Obama years, we saw militia numbers really rising again. So it definitely didn't go away. I think you do hit on something really interesting, though. Militias in the 90s really were only able to flourish by, people going to gun shows and sort of handing off literature and flyers and recruiting people through these face-to-face interactions. Now with social media, it's just much more easy for people to get together and, meet people they wouldn't typically meet that are outside of their area or their town. So we are seeing numbers again, I think, go up. I don't have a sense of if this is like, if militia numbers are higher than they are in the 90s. I would doubt that, but we did see them really going up under Obama. And of course, there are a lot of things happening right now that are kind of things that militias have been talking about for a long time. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're seeing more numbers.
The protests over the summer certainly made for an explosive mix of various groups and political ideologies, but a literal explosive atmosphere occurred 40 years ago with the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and we marked the 40th anniversary of the eruption on May 18th, 1980. But you'd be forgiven for sort of forgetting about it because many of the events of this year to commemorate it were put on hold, and all the other news going on may have made you forget about it. Well, Nick Deshay did not forget about it. He covered much of the science that was going on current day and joined us in May on the anniversary to talk about one of the famous scientists who was there on the day of the explosion who died.
David Johnston, a real fascinating guy. At the time of the eruption, he was 30 years old. He had a doctorate. He was a volcanologist. And he was on that ridge the morning of the eruption. And, the eruption happened at around 8:32 in the morning on a Sunday on May 18th. It followed a 5.1 magnitude earthquake, which basically knocked a bunch of dirt and earth off the side of the volcano and allowing the eruption to shoot off the side right towards Mr. Johnston. He was about 6 miles away from the mountain, but they guessed that he had less than a minute to react and to live. What he did in his last moments was get on the radio and famously say, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." And then he was gone. And what's interesting and tragic as well is he wasn't supposed to be there that morning. He had traded shifts with another scientist, this guy named Harry Glicken.
Of course, natural disasters in the Northwest aren't reserved for volcanic eruptions. In fact, most of them happen as, say, floods or wildfires. In fact, this past summer, all of us were affected in some way by the thick smoke that inundated the region. Hundreds of people lost their homes in the Labor Day fires. Courtney Flatt covers wildfire for us. She also covers the science of fires. She reminded us that these fires of this year were somewhat reminiscent of a big burn 100 years ago.
Things were already really bad. And by that, I mean the vegetation throughout Washington, the stuff that burns and fuels wildfires, was really, really dry. And then on Labor Day, really strong winds pushed through the area. Forecasters knew this was going to happen, and they pleaded with people to not start wildfires over the holiday weekend. And then on Sunday and Monday, fires were started, and it was just really impossible for firefighters to catch once the winds pushed through.
All right. And, the term that gets thrown around so much, of course, in these times is climate change. And there's a whole set of political debates about that we're not going to get into now. But really, what part of the conversation about these fires and just all the things that we've seen over the past few years can really be attributed to climate change? How does that enter into the conversation?
Well, you can't really attribute any one event to climate change, but climate change is going to make fire seasons longer and more severe. And one of the researchers I spoke to said a big reason that this is going to happen is because forests are going to be drier and ready to burn. And there are a lot of things that contribute to forest dryness, things like the timing of snowpack, spring and summer precipitation, and heat. And all of that's going to change with climate change. So that just means that our wet forests are going to burn more often. Kind of like what we're seeing on the western side of the state right now. That could maybe become more of a new normal. Another thing to note is that after all of that said, less is known about what that means for our large rangeland fires.
Those were just a few of the stories that we brought to you in 2020. We look forward to bringing you many more in 2021. If you'd like to learn more about all of the news that we've covered this year, or to support the news and information of this public media station, you can see our website at nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.